Welcome to this webinar, How to Improve Comprehension and Retention. We're going to focus specifically on reading informational material here. So what I want to introduce to you, if you're not already familiar, is how to get better comprehension and retention when you're reading informative material. Maybe it's a book that's nonfiction, maybe you're reading it for your career, or just something you're very interested in. You can apply something called the multiple reading process. Now, this is a multi-step process. It starts with a preview. Now, the preview, the whole point of a preview is to read the introduction and the summary. Okay, so let's say we have material. I'm going to pull up my Kindle program. This is a book called The Ascent of Money, A Financial History of the World. And let's say I was reading chapter 1 in this book. When I look at chapter 1, I look at the first few pages and I see, you know what? This seems like this first paragraph here, or maybe the first two, I'm going to read this as my introduction. So that's part of this preview. But I also have to read the summary. So I skip all the way to the end. I could keep flipping like this, but a faster way is probably just to go to chapter 2 and then go back one page. That's the end of chapter 1 right here. So the end of chapter 1 is right over here. I'm going to read the last two paragraphs here. Or you could read the last paragraph, whatever you want. And I would read this without using Accelerator. Since it's only one or two paragraphs, I don't usually copy and paste one or two paragraphs into Accelerator. If it's a number of paragraphs, then I will. But you can already see that these last two paragraphs start to summarize it. So the evolution of banking was thus an essential first step in the ascent of money. This paragraph right here is going to summarize chapter 1. So again, the preview is simply a matter of reading the intro and the summary, and for different types of material that means different things. That could mean reading the first and last paragraph. That could also mean reading an entire introduction that lasts maybe 3 pages, or an entire conclusion which lasts 2, 3, 4, or 5 pages. Keep in mind, if you're reading, an article, it's going to probably be shorter than if you're reading a textbook. And if you do read textbooks, it's very easy to find that introduction and conclusion, because introductions usually either say introduction or objectives or something else that gives you an idea. Here's an intro to the chapter, and here is a summary or a conclusion to the chapter. Now, I have this little diagram on the side of the slide, which is an inverted triangle. This upside down triangle is going to kind of mimic the multiple reading process, because on the second step we move down the triangle. The second step is the overview. And notice how we're starting with general and then we get to a little more specific. So the overview is where you get your concepts. The preview was getting the intro and the summary. Getting your concepts means, if you're reading, let's say, a textbook, that would mean reading the headings and subheadings. Now, let's say you have no headings and subheadings. You would be reading the first sentence of every paragraph. Why? Because the first sentence tends to be the main idea or the topic sentence. So if we go back to our reading material here, and let's say I'm at the beginning of the chapter. At the beginning of this particular chapter, Dreams of Avarice, what we would do is we would start reading, okay, let me read the first sentence here, I'm going to read the first sentence here, I go on, and I'm not putting this into Accelerator or anything like that, I'm just reading along. Or if you want, if you have a lot of headings and subheadings and boldface words, you can just simply read all of the headings and subheadings that you see there. So you might read The Money Mountain. You might read, let's see if there's any other headings or subheadings. I'm looking at some of the pictures, obviously. I see another heading here, Loan Sharks. Now, there's a variety of ways that you can do this second step of an overview. So you could read the first sentences of all the paragraphs plus the headings and the subheadings, or you could simply read just the headings and subheadings plus boldface words. Whatever you really want here, the whole idea is that you kind of deconstruct and take apart your chapter piece by piece. That's if you're reading, I'm assuming you're reading on the screen here. Maybe it's a PDF, maybe it's a book in your Kindle program over here, or whatever else it might be. Let's say you're reading a blog post, and somebody has, let's say, let's say it's called The 7 Steps to Doing Whatever it is the article is about. During the overview is where I would be reading those 7 steps. The preview is where I would probably just read the first and last paragraph. Now, after I do the overview and I have an idea of the concepts, before I get to the third step, which is to read it, I make a very important decision after doing the overview. Is this article or this chapter worth my time? I want you to really think about that when you're reading, because very few people do. And it's a huge mistake that they're making. There is so much reading out there that you could be doing right now. You need to realize that not everything is worth your time, so we need to be picky. And this is why the multiple reading process is superior to other ways of reading, because it allows you to figure out, is this really worth my time? So when I'm starting off and I'm getting general, a little more specific, before I get to reading it, I can actually decide whether or not this actually makes sense to take some time out of my day to read and get the details. Sometimes you've got enough information at this point to say, you know what, I don't need the details. Now let's say you really need to read it, or you really want to read it. You want to get 100% of the information. That's where we get to step 3, the read. This is where most people start off, by the way, and that's a mistake. I would say for any kind of informational material, the worst way you could possibly read the material is by just going from beginning to end. It's probably it's not the smartest way to read through informational text. Why? Because you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Think about this. If you're previewing and overviewing, you already know what to expect, so by the time you get to the reading step, you'll be able to read faster. You already will be able to get better comprehension because you know what to expect. And what about retention? I want you to know that what you remember from the reading that you do is largely based on repetition. And look at how much repetition we already have going on here. Preview, overview, read. You're more likely to remember something if you've had some sort of repetition. Now you could further reinforce the repetition by taking notes while you're doing this whole process. So here's how you would be taking notes. You preview, you read your intro and summary, then you would take some notes. Let's say you're doing mind mapping. We had a mind mapping course that a lot of people are really into. Mind mapping is a great way of processing information. You would preview and then you would add some notes to your mind map. And then you would overview the material, reading maybe headings and subheadings, reading first sentences, and then you would add some more material to your mind map. And then you would read, and while you're reading, here and there you're taking notes. Think about all that repetition. Taking notes is a form of repetition, and that's going to help you remember the material. So let's say you were reading this material on the screen. After you've done your preview, after you've done your overview, the third step is where you highlight all the material, copy and paste it into Accelerator, and then you want to set it at a speed that is appropriate for that material. Now let's say your regular reading speed is 300 words a minute, or 400, or 500 or more. Whatever you're comfortable with. If you've already done a preview and overview, you should set the speed at a little faster than you would normally read it if you were just going beginning to end. Now, why would you do this? It's because you've already done the preview and the overview, and that allows you to read faster when you get to that third step. So make sure that you're setting it at a speed that, it's not too slow, but it's not too fast either, but it's at a challenging rate that kind of forces you to focus on the material and also know that your brain is ready for that information, so it's going to be able to go faster and comprehend the material. Now, usually after we're done reading, most people stop, but if you really need to know, let's say you need to know the chapter inside out, detail by detail, there's a fourth step called a final review. This is where you zero in on maybe some of the parts of the chapter or the text where maybe you're going to be tested on it. Or maybe you really need to know it for work because you're doing a presentation and you need to kind of go over the finer points. The final review is where you go back and maybe reread any kind of technical information to make sure that you understand it very well. The final review could also be, sometimes my final review is simply repeating step number 2. So that's another way to do it, looking at your headings and subheadings one more time, or reading the first sentences of each paragraph. Keep in mind, that's what we do in the overview. First sentences of paragraphs and headings, subheadings, and bold-faced words. The final review is where you could repeat that step. And why do we repeat it? Remember we said repetition helps us remember things. I'll repeat that. Repetition helps you remember things. So all this repetition in the final review, if I could do something very quick, like just looking at headings and subheadings one more time, I've reviewed it for myself, and it's easier to remember later on because I've got all that repetition going on. Now, this is an optional step. Sometimes you're done reading and you feel like, you know what, I don't need to do any final review. I know this well. But this fourth step is kind of like a reinforcement step. If you need to do it, it's optional. There's another optional step here called a recite, or talking about the material. Anytime you talk about something, it helps you to remember it better. It helps you to learn it better. So if you did all these 5 steps, if you have very technical information, if you're a college student and you're studying for a test and you need to know the information inside out, I recommend you do all 5 of these steps. When I'm reading magazines, I'm usually just doing 2 or 3 steps. Why 2 or 3? Because sometimes I preview an overview and I realize, you know what, this magazine article is not really worth my time. I'm not even going to bother reading it. Sometimes I finish the overview and I say, you know what, this is really interesting. I do want to read it. So it depends on your goals, and make sure that you use this process as kind of a framework for how you approach informational material, and you could use this in combination with the Accelerator. Just make sure that before you paste any material into Accelerator, you do these first two steps, the preview and the overview, before you get to reading it. On the third step, that's when you can copy and paste and set it at a speed that's appropriate. So take these steps, use them. I want you to practice this, and I think you'll find this is a great way to get better comprehension and better retention when you're reading informational material.